Welcome back to the Logic Pro Tips channel. In this video, I'm going to give you my 10 quick tips to get the very most out of the channel EQ. Let's dive straight in. I'm Sam, the Producer Tutor. You can find me on all socials at the Producer Tutor. Before I jump into this quick tutorial, make sure you give us a thumbs up if you like the video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you know when future videos are coming up. Here we go then, 10 quick tips to get the very most out of the Logic Pro X channel EQ. Let's start with some simple stuff. So I've just got this simple loop that I'm going to use. I pulled it in from the Apple Loops library, just so we've got some audio in this project to work along with. Now, everybody knows that if you click on the little EQ box here, it'll pull up a channel EQ on your channel strip. That's a really useful feature, for sure. But what if we want to quickly pull up a different sort of equalizer? Say, for example, a linear phase EQ. Well, if I hold Shift and click in that box, it'll do exactly the same thing, but pull up a linear phase EQ for me. That's a really helpful little shortcut. So that's Shift and click in that box, and that'll bring up a linear phase EQ. Now, what about if I've already got a bunch of stuff in my signal chain here? So let's just throw on some compressors. Now, what about if I want to put a channel EQ in the first slot in that signal chain? Well, no problem. Just hold Option and click, and it'll put that channel EQ in the first position in the signal chain above everything else that follows it. And you've guessed it, what about if I want to combine those shortcuts? So if I hold Shift and Option and click in that little box, it's going to put that linear phase EQ in that first position in my signal chain. So those are some really quick shortcuts. Tip number one, to get your EQs where you want them. Now, tip number two is a really simple one. Let's say I've got this band here and I'm moving it around to find the frequency and the amount of gain that I want. But then I want to adjust the Q of it, so the bandwidth. I can just use the scroll wheel on my mouse and scroll up and down, and that'll adjust the Q of that band for me. And if I've got multiple bands all up at the same time, I can adjust Qs just by going along to the different bands. And once the band is highlighted, I can adjust the Qs there. So that's number two, adjusting the bandwidth. Tip number three is all about holding Command. Now, if you hold Command on your keyboard and then grab a node, whatever direction you go in, it'll fix the action. So because I first moved left to right to adjust the frequency, I can no longer move up and down. It'll just allow me to change that frequency, which is great. If I release and then re-hold Command and now go up and down, it won't allow me to drag it left and right. It'll be fixed on just adjusting the gain of that particular band, which is really useful if you're looking to just dial in a specific gain on one node or frequency without sort of going freestyle and being able to adjust all those things. Now, what about if you want to, say, still adjust the frequency but also the Q? Well, if you hold Option and Command, you'll see that the cursor changes to have that little Q next to it, which means that the up and down motion that was previously gain is now substituted for Q. So now if I drag up and down, you'll see that it's adjusting the Q, not the gain, and I can also do the frequency left and right. So now I can adjust Q and frequency simultaneously with the gain being fixed. So that's Option and Command simultaneously. There's tip number four for you. Tip number five is all about adjusting the analyzer range. Let's just pull this back to default. Now, the analyzer range is on the left-hand side here. Now, if you don't have the analyzer on, then it'll just be the same as the scale range on the right. So we need to turn the analyzer on. What that'll do is give us that kind of fuzzy line that shows us what frequencies are present in this loop. Now, what about if, say, I'm working with a really quiet signal? So let's just trim this back by, I don't know, 15 dB, so make it much, much quieter. You'll see that this frequency that it's displaying is kind of hard to see because the input signal is much lower. But what I can do then is just to pull it up on the left-hand side, and that's going to increase the size of the wave that I'm looking at. So even if I'm working with a really quiet input signal, I can still trim up that waveform so I can see exactly what I'm looking at. Conversely, what if I'm working with a really loud signal? Now I'm going to have to be careful with my gain here, so let's just pull that back to compensate. So similarly, I can trim that down so that the really hot input signal isn't going to be kind of all the way up here. So let's put these things back to normal. Let's turn off that gain so that we don't need it. The other option is if you control click or right click on that analyzer menu, you can change it from a 60 dB resolution to 120 dB, which basically means that the stretch of that frequency representation is much narrower. So 120, you're going to have a much sort of more shallow frequency representation there. Nice, so there you go, that is tip number 5. Tip number 6 is all about the scale on the right hand side. So again, let's say we've got some EQ moves here that we've done very unscientifically. I can firstly adjust the position of all of my EQ bands by budging them up and down here, which is a useful thing. So why is that useful? Well, let's say I really wanted to hone in on, say, what the kick drum is doing. What I could do is to target the level of my frequency bands on the point that I'm trying to target so that I can then go and grab it much more accurately. Because if it was still all the way down here, then I couldn't be so confident that I'm accurately getting the right frequency that I want. So that's a really useful feature. What about other options though? So I can right click again, and let's say now I want to do something really minute, something really specific. Say I want to just pull out something very subtly. Well, I haven't quite got the control that I want here. So if I go into this menu, I can go to linear 12 dB, and that's going to zoom in much more closely. So you'll see that this 2 dB cut that I've done here is going to become much bigger, where it's zoomed in so that it's now looking at a closer kind of representation. So now I've got 6 dB and above and below my line, whereas previously I had 30 dB above and below. So it's in total, so 15 above, 15 below. So it gives you a much finer resolution. Conversely as well, if I wanted to do something really sweeping, a really big move, I could go to 60 dB, which will give me 30 above, 30 below, and then I'm able to do a much larger move, whereas previously if I'm on linear 30, it's a really kind of big kind of change there. So that's a really great thing. That's tip number 6 for you. Tip number 7 is all about this analyzer button down here. Now the analyzer button, as we've already figured out, will allow us to turn on and off that analyzer representation. I can also change it from being post EQ to pre EQ. So if I've made a bunch of EQ changes and I want to see what the wave looked like beforehand, I can toggle between pre and post EQ, which will allow me to see what the waveform was before my EQ and what it is that I've done to it with my EQ moves. But there's more that I can do with the analyzer. So I can right click on the analyzer here, and I can actually change how it behaves from peak to RMS, which is really useful if I want to get that sort of more averaged feel that you get from RMS rather than a very fast response from peaks. You can also change the resolution of the analyzer as well here, in the same way that you could change the scale and the analyzer range on the left hand side here. So that's another really useful thing. Tip number 8 is this Q couple button. Now the Q couple button's really interesting. What it allows you to do is effectively adjust the Q automatically when you adjust the gain. So what that's going to do is preserve the perceived bandwidth of the Q. So what it means is as I pull the gain up, it's going to adjust the Q relative to that gain amount in order to keep the bandwidth feeling the same, perceived as the same. If I turn that off and as I adjust it, how that bandwidth behaves is going to sound different. Now, a slightly annoying thing is that it doesn't give you any kind of clear representation here on the actual readout. It's a sort of internal behavioral thing. But what you can see that it does is when you check it on and off here, it is actually changing the Q amount, the bandwidth amount, but unfortunately it doesn't kind of change it visually on the readout. That's a really useful feature. Hopefully they'll update it so that when you've got it on Q couple here as well, when you turn it on and off, it's going to actually physically, you're going to see it changing on the representation there. Tip number 9 is all about this HQ button. Now HQ stands for high quality, and what it effectively is oversampling. Now, you'll want to use this if you are, firstly, EQing frequencies above 5 kilohertz, so up here in the upper frequencies. If you're doing that, you want to be using your oversampling high quality button. Also using it if you are working in a sample rate that's less than 96 kilohertz, which you probably are if you're working at home. So if you're working at 48 or 44.1, and also working on frequencies above this 5 kilohertz range, you'll want to be using the oversampling, the high quality button there. If you are working at 96 kilohertz, then you don't need to worry about that so much, but it can still help. And what that's going to do is effectively stop this equalizer from doing anything nasty to your upper end, making it sound a bit weird, a bit kind of filtered. That's what it's there to do. So it's got oversampling built in. And tip number 10 is all about this processing button. So in this channel EQ, you've got stereo as default. So what that means is any EQ moves that you make is going to be done equally to the left and right channels. However, you can tell it to work just on the left channel, or just on the right channel, or just on the mids, or just on the sides. So what that means effectively is that you've got mid-side EQ built in. So let's say I wanted to target just the kick drum, but just on the mid channel. I can do that. To bring out the kick more, but just in the mids. And then I could have another EQ in side mode just to bring out the kind of the hi-hats and the cymbals and the air at the sides. So you've got mid-side EQ built in. Now, hopefully in a future update, they'll combine these so that you're able to have more than one different processing mode set up on one equalizer. But for the time being, you can only have your EQ set up to process in one way. So if you want to do mid and side, then as I've done here, you'll need to set up 2 separate EQs. Now, there is one final bonus tip. After all those 10 tips, I'm going to give you a final bonus tip. So let's say I have done some stereo EQ moves here. So let's just unscientifically cut out some boxiness, maybe a little high shelf, maybe a little low pass around 30 hertz. So there's my EQ. So overall, I've put level into this loop. I've made it louder because I'm doing more boosts than I am cuts, right? Now, great, I can gain stage here on my EQ. So let's say I need to pull out around 4 dB. But I don't like how that looks because that doesn't really represent what it is that I've done, doesn't represent the moves that I've made. It's a little bit clunky. But that's cool because I can just right click here and turn off the visualize master gain option. And what that'll do is to leave the gain staging in, but keep my wave looking nice as it did previously before I gained stage to match, which is a really great feature. So there you go, 10 tips for getting the most out of Logic Pro's stock channel EQ, which I'm sure you didn't know, plus a bonus tip as well. Now, if you enjoyed this and you want some more info on Logic's stock equalizers, I've got a whole course on Logic's vintage EQ collection, where I'm going to do a load of side-by-side comparisons of Logic stock, Neve, API and Pultec EQs alongside some premium equalizers from other manufacturers to give you a real flavour of just how good the stock vintage EQ collection is within Logic Pro X. So the link for that is down in the description below. You can go and grab that. In the meantime, until I'm back with the next little video, I hope you're great and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.